We did our contrastive analysis project on Mandarin Chinese versus English. Mandarin Chinese is also known as Haiyu or Gaiyu. It is currently the official language of China as well as Taiwan. Up until the year 1912, China did not have an official language that was spoken throughout the country. Instead, citizens spoke various different languages. The Republic of China decided in 1913 that it was time to propose an official language for China. Although it took years of deliberation, by 1918 they decided they would use the Zhuang alphabet as the official Chinese alphabet. Now there is no alphabet for Chinese. It is made up of various symbols which are called characters. These characters are based off of the Zhuang alphabet. It wasn't until 1932 that Mandarin was officially adopted, and today 70% of China speaks fluent Mandarin. We now know that the Mandarin language doesn't have an alphabet, it has a set of characters. These characters are broken into simplified and traditional characters. The traditional characters are less commonly used due to the fact that they have more strokes and take more time to write. More seen is simplified characters. The characters in the written language are called Hanzi, and these characters originally started out as ancient pictures of humans or animals, but today the pictures don't mean what they used to. Although there are over 50,000 characters in the written language, a person only needs to know about 3,000 in order to be fluent in the language. This is due to the fact that the original characters turn into something else. Each character in the written language represents a syllable instead of a whole word. Each character in the system contains strokes. Some characters only contain 1 or 2 strokes, but some characters can have up to 12 strokes. The ones with more strokes are the traditional characters versus the simplified ones. If you ever look at a sentence written in Chinese, there are no spaces in the sentences. Sentences in the 19th century do contain simple punctuation such as periods to determine when a sentence is complete. The example shown says, "Have you eaten?" Notice that there are no spaces, but there is a question mark to state it is a question. Mandarin is a regional variety of the Chinese language. Chinese has many different variations, one of them being Mandarin, another being Cantonese. Mandarin is the most prominent variation of the Chinese language, and it is spoken by about 2/3 of China's inhabitants. Mandarin is spoken in North and Southwest China. Other dialects spoken in China are Wu, Gan, Zhang, Hakka, Yu, and Min. If you look at the map shown, it shows a map of China and the dialects spoken. The light purple color, or pink, is Mandarin. If you can't tell, most of China speaks Mandarin. Here are a couple quick facts about the Mandarin language. The language has roughly 50,000 characters, but like I stated before, you only need to know 3,000 in order to be fluent in the language. The language has no complexities, meaning there are no verb conjugations, tenses are expressed in simple ways such as tomorrow, yesterday, etc., and there are no gender-specific nouns or no plural forms of characters. Chinese is also the fastest growing language in the world. Chinese speakers use both sides of their brains, while English speakers only use the left side. And lastly, Chinese characters are the oldest in the world.
Chinese syntax is very different in comparison with English syntax. For example, what precedes modifies what follows in a sentence. So if you see to the side our statement "red wine I don't really like," which is translated from Mandarin, you can see that red wine is placed first, whereas in English one would typically say "I don't really like red wine." Verbs and adjectives do not really conjugate or change due to number, meaning that verbs are typically always in the infinitive, and adjectives do not have a gender, and words in general do not have a gender in Mandarin. Mandarin is topic predominant, whereas English is subject predominant, as you can see again in the sentence, "red wine I don't really like," versus saying "I do not like red wine." Aspect is relative to time and completion of an action instead of tenses. So an example of this would be in English if you say, last year I went to China and saw the Great Wall. Instead, in Mandarin Chinese, you would say, last year I went to China, or last year I went to China and I see. You would not change the second verb, or would you change the first? So last year I go and I see. Mandarin grammar rules are consistent once learned, meaning that your grasp of grammar you can grasp your grammar very quickly, and it can be applied to other things, and there's a strong chance that you will immediately have the right structure in doing it. Once time or number is indicated in a sentence, it does not need to be stated again, which again refers to aspect and the idea of, if you state that last year you went hiking or you went and saw the Great Wall of China, it would be known already what period it was in. Mandarin syllables are made up of 4 sounds: a consonant, a glide, a vowel, and nasal, in that order. The consonant and the glide are produced with one sound when both are present, as if the G or the glide, was treated as more of a secondary sound. Adding a suffix changes the rhyme and takes away a nasal sound, adding a retroflex, meaning it changes the pronunciation and the location of the tongue in the mouth. And a rhyme is a part of a syllable with a vowel and what comes after it, meaning in the word spoil, O-I-L, so the vowel and the consonants that follow after it would be the rhyme. It changes the pronunciation of it. And there are 5 vowels in standard Mandarin Chinese, and they change depending on what is surrounding them. Therefore, it can change vowel sounds to a closed glide, it can form a diphthong, or rounding. Mandarin phonology is comprised of full and weak syllables, and I'm going to talk a lot about moras, and moras are a unit of phonology that determines the syllable weight, and in some languages it determines the stress or timing. And full syllables are heavy and have 2 moras each, and are mostly content words, have tones, and are long, whereas weak syllables are light and have 1 mora, are mostly grammatical words, and they do not have their own tones. The stress and intonation are different between full and weak syllables. I can give you some examples in English, which would be something similar to a word pancake, where the emphasis is on the pan. So pan in the Mandarin comparison, would be more like a full syllable, whereas the weak would be cake, because it tends to fall off the end of the word a little bit more. Pancake. And an example where you would see 2 full syllables would be an English word comparable to that of blackboard, because you have equal emphasis on the 2 parts. Mandarin morphology is very difficult to define because Mandarin does not have words in the same way that English does. For example, the word was translated into Mandarin Chinese in the 20th century, when it was missing from the vocabulary of traders and anybody who was trying to work in China at the time, or in other areas that speak Chinese or Mandarin Chinese, So for the following reasons, it is hard to define a word in Mandarin. The morpheme typically corresponds to a single syllable or its orthographic character. There are no distinctions between roots and affixes. Bound roots require another syllable in Mandarin, but do not require a specific affix given in direction. And because morphemes are hard to define, there is no way to study deviation or flexion. To talk a little bit more about roots and affixes in morphology in the Mandarin language, we have roots in English like bio or socio that cannot stand on their own, but when attached to something have meaning, whereas in Mandarin these do not exist as much. And for example, there is a word ya, which in Mandarin means duck, and then there's the word z, or not the word z, but the syllable z, which means child. So placed together, directly translated, it means duck child, or yazi, duckling. What makes Mandarin difficult in comparison with English is that in English, you have distinctions between roots and affixes like bio versus legi, whereas in Mandarin you are required to have a connection to the word, or a root and an affix in a word, whereas the order of them is not specific. So in Mandarin, you could say ology bio and it would be completely correct, or you could say ziya, which is, child duck instead of duck child, and it is absolutely correct. In a comparison of English and Mandarin Chinese, English has about 10,000 monosyllables, whereas Mandarin has about 400 syllables total. 2/3 of the syllables sounds are excluded due to two requirements, meaning that Mandarin could have up to 1,300 syllables, but they're excluded because the consonant and the glide cannot have the same place of articulation in the mouth, and the consonant glide single sound can only be used once. In addition to this, there is a lack of polysyllabic words in Mandarin, and a small syllable inventory and a high homophone density means that distinctive tones are the way that they differentiate between words. So, as you can see to the right, the word one tone can distinguish a word from being mother, from being hemp, from being horse, or from being to scold. Because of this and the variation in the Mandarin dialects, there is a dual vocabulary and a variation of heavy and light syllables, and the frequency of syllable reduction in the same sense that it exists in English, where we cut our words short and all of that stuff. It makes the syllable variation in Mandarin, very, very small. So oftentimes a word can have up to 15 different meanings. In addition to that, it can sometimes be difficult to transition between the two languages because pitch in English is used to emphasize emotion, whereas pitch in Mandarin is used to emphasize or to distinguish a word.
There are many differences between the English and Mandarin languages, therefore resulting in many difficulties for Mandarin English language learners. In English, we use an alphabetic writing system where we use letters to represent words, whereas in Mandarin, they use a logographic writing system. In this type of writing system, symbols are used to represent words. Mandarin Chinese does not use syllables to write words as we often do in English. Another major difference is how we use the change of pitch of phonemes. In English, we change our pitch high or low to express emotion, such as, I am very hungry. In Mandarin, speakers change the pitch of a phoneme sound to distinguish word meaning. An example might be desert to express a dry place with little or no water, and desert to express the action of abandoning something or someone. English is an inflected language where we use verb inflection to convey meaning, such as changing the verb tense is, are, were in a sentence, whereas Mandarin is an uninflected language where there are no verb tenses and rather conveys word meaning through word order. The English language uses modal verbs such as may or can to ask permission or must to express obligation. An example would be, I must go to the store. The difference between English and Mandarin is that Mandarin speakers do not use articles. English is a polysyllabic language, meaning that each word may contain more than one syllable, but in Mandarin, each symbol represents only one syllable. The sentence structure of both languages is very similar. The only difference that may make learning English difficult for Mandarin speakers is that when there is a time word, such as, she got married last Saturday, English speakers put the time word at the end of the sentence, whereas a Mandarin speaker would say, last Saturday, she got married. Another major difference between English and Mandarin is that we have the use of plurals in English, and in Mandarin, they use a number word in front of a singular to express a plural noun. An example is, my cats versus my many cat.
Listen to the 4 Chinese words which appear in Display 1. They are presented in the traditional order of the 4 tones.
Ma, 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 ma.
Again.
Ma, 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 ma.
The final major difference between the two languages is where the vowel sounds are made within the mouth. This chart shows the vowel differences in the two languages. It shows which vowel sounds are produced in each place of the mouth, either the front, central, or back, and whether they are close, close mid, open mid, or open. It also shows high, mid-low, and low vowel sounds for both Mandarin and English. Because English has more vowel sounds than the Mandarin language, Mandarin English language learners often mispronounce many of the vowel sounds. Some examples are sheep instead of ship, eat instead of it, and fool instead of full. Mandarin ELLs have difficulty hearing the difference in the sounds between L and R. They mispronounce English words such as saying lice for rice, rake for lake, and lead for red. They cannot distinguish between the two sounds. This may make it difficult for them when having conversations and trying to understand the meanings of words. There are no final consonants in Mandarin, so Mandarin Ls often have difficulty pronouncing words with the final consonant sound. They will often fail to produce the consonant or simply add a vowel after the final consonant. Instead of saying feed, a Mandarin speaker may say something such as fee and fail to produce the d sound, or simply add a vowel to the end such as o to say fido. Another difficulty that these Ls might face is the idea of phrasal verbs, which are short verbs that very commonly combine with adverbs or prepositions. Examples of common phrasal verbs in English are give in, take on, make do with, and look up to. Mandarin speakers may avoid using these phrasal verbs altogether, making it very difficult for them to comprehend text containing such verbs. Syllables are often a challenge for Mandarin speakers when learning English. In English, there are over 8,000 syllables compared to Mandarin's 1,700 possible syllables. There is a difference in the noun usage between the two languages. Mandarin speakers may have difficulty with the idea of abstract nouns when learning English. Abstract nouns are interchangeable things such as feelings, concepts, or actions. In the Mandarin language, they use concrete nouns, which are tangible nouns that you can experience with your five senses. Mandarin Chinese Ls may have difficulty with the idea of the abstract versus concrete noun usage and confuse the two in conversation. The order of words within a sentence varies between the two languages. In English, you might say, yesterday, my friend whom you met before read a book recommended by her teacher for 2 hours in the library before she went home for dinner. But in Mandarin Chinese, you may express the same idea by saying, before you meet that my friend, yesterday before she go home for dinner in the library for 2 hours read, recommended by she teacher that book. The word order not only may be difficult for a student learning English, but it can also be difficult for a listener to understand what the speaker is trying to convey because native English speakers do not speak with the words in that order. In the Mandarin language, the syllables of words never end with consonants, except with the sounds n or ng. As a result, Chinese learners either omit the final consonant or add an extra sound after it, which makes it very difficult for English speakers to follow. Although most consonants will be difficult to pronounce at word endings for Chinese, voiced consonants are the most challenging ones. Voiced consonants are consonants that need vibration at the throat, like b, d, z, g, v, shun, j, and th. In addition to omitting these consonants or adding an extra sound after them, Chinese learners also devoice them, which means that the b becomes p, the d becomes t, z becomes s, g becomes k, and v becomes f. Chinese English language learners will often express difficulty with consonant clusters. The consonant clusters listed on this slide are the most common difficulties. It will be difficult for Mandarin speakers to pronounce these consonant clusters. It may even become frustrating for both the speaker and English proficient listener to have a conversation due to the miscommunications in the language.
So now on to the cultural aspect of what some of your Mandarin Chinese students might be coming from in terms of their cultural experiences. U.S. society really values individualism, competition, self-expression, and your students might have a hard time adjusting to these differences because the majority of social values for your Chinese students are derived from Confucianism and Taoism. There's this really strong idea of collectivism, that individuals are viewed in relation to others. And so your students who are used to that collectivism are not going to necessarily understand the more individualistic society of America. The other big belief is that social hierarchy is a natural part of life. And so, how that comes into play is that authority figures are to be respected. Students are used to maintaining a clear social distance from authority figures like teachers. And so, that's something teachers need to be aware of. Also, the idea of karma, to accept one's fate, that suffering is a result of past actions in a past life. And one positive is to be aware that success in school and finding a good career are highly valued. And so teachers can capitalize on the high value that a family places on school. But you should also be aware that your low performing students might be under a lot of pressure from family members and could even be seen as dishonoring their family by not excelling academically. And so that's something to be sensitive about. So, in terms of communication rules, there are formal rules of communication that are based on social status. And so, questions that Americans might consider to be rude, like, how old are you, are a way to ascertain an individual's social standing so that those communication rules can be followed. The biggest thing to know about your Mandarin students is that they're going to be using an indirect communication style. Lots of gestures, facial expressions, silence as a way to communicate, postures and positioning. So much of this information is going to be conveyed through nonverbal cues, and this may seem evasive or non-committal to Americans who are used to a more direct communication style. It's inappropriate to display anger or contradict others, and so maintaining outward calmness, being reserved and quiet, is extremely important in this culture. And so something like interrupting a conversation might be rude, and silence might be used as a way to avoid expressing disagreement. So rather than engaging in an argument or stating their opinion, your students or their families might just remain silent as a way to avoid that argument. So back to that idea of nonverbal behavior. Eye contact is super important because direct eye contact is actually considered rude. A polite smile, a nod, or a yes might indicate that a speaker has understood a message, not that he or she actually agrees with you. So a yes doesn't necessarily indicate agreement. Students or their parents might say yes to a teacher and then fail to follow through on an agreed upon action. So teachers need to be aware of that. They might have to ask more than once. Another important concept is personal space. Some groups might be used to more personal space than an American would expect, and it's really important to not violate that personal space boundary. And self-expression is not encouraged, and so that's something that teachers might not be used to. Their students of American parents might be a lot more encouraging of students to express themselves, to express their opinions, to express their emotions. But your Chinese students might not be comfortable with that, especially when they are first arriving. So some of those underlying norms, back to the idea of social status, that can be determined by age and gender. And so teachers should address the male or older members of the family first as a sign of respect. Teachers should defer to those family members when decisions about school are made. And the other thing has to do with gender. It might be considered inappropriate to shake hands with the member of the opposite sex, just something to be aware of. The idea that children should be seen and not heard is definitely prevalent among Chinese culture. And so verbal forms of communication are not emphasized. The Confucian belief that children should limit their self-expression is actually in direct conflict with the US mainstream cultural belief that children should express themselves freely. Your Chinese children are expected to be modest and respectful at all times. And so promoting self-esteem and self-expression might not be a priority for their parents. Asian parents might praise their children less frequently than than teachers expect. And your Asian students may be uncomfortable with individual attention, especially when it comes to being asked to express their individual thoughts, feelings, and opinions. They, in the past, have been encouraged to conform and to show respect by not having any opinions. And so when you ask them to start doing that, they might be uncomfortable. So, some best practices for teachers would be to give your students time to acclimate. What that means is to ease slowly into those activities that do require critical thinking, problem solving, forming judgments, or expressing opinions. They also might not want to read in front of the class or participate in a discussion. And so keep in mind that cultural norm of collectivism. They might be more comfortable working in small groups at first. They would not be comfortable receiving that individual attention. And so keep that in mind when you are planning activities around these students. Something you can do is encourage your students to be bicultural. And so they can have one set of communication rules that they use at home and one that they use at school. So at school, they might feel more comfortable to express an opinion, to write an argument writing piece, to involve themselves in a class discussion or something like a debate. And then at home, they would still adhere to those rules of conformity and modesty. You can also find differentiated ways to assess their expressive communication skills. And so if they're not comfortable talking in front of the whole class, then find a different way to assess that skill. Also, don't just assume that quiet or reserved students need to be evaluated for special ed or speech services. Definitely be aware of your own cultural biases when it comes to your quiet students. Take the time to find out why they are being quiet. Take the time to find out what their family norms are like, what their family might be expecting of them, what culture they're coming from, and be aware of that as a way to help ease your students into some of these American ideals that might be very different for them. Here's a list of some of our resources. If you have any further questions, definitely feel free to reach out to any of our group members or post them in the discussion forum. Thanks for listening.